Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time of day you may be watching. I'm Michael Trochet. This is Casual Roundhouse Fight Talk, and we're not going to waste any time jumping right into the recap. First, with UFC Fight Night, Yusuff versus Barboza. Behind us, we're going to look back on it briefly. First fight of the card, Emily Ducote versus Ashley Yoder. Impressive decision win for Ducote. She landed the more thudding shots as well as dishing out visible damage to Yoder, and towards the second half of the fight, she was cutting the cage off and walking Yoder down a lot more easily. Underrated fight, sort of set the tone for the rest of the card in my opinion. Next fight, Chris Gutierrez versus Alatengheili. Chris Gutierrez did almost exactly what I thought he would do, stayed at kicking range, destroyed Alatengheili's lead leg, and controlled the fight from the outside, cruising to a decision victory. Following the win, he called for a fight against either Davison Figueiredo, Rob Font, or the winner of Ricky Simone versus Mario Bautista. All very intriguing matchups for him. Step up in competition without a doubt as well. Next fight, Irina Alekseeva versus Melissa Dixon. Melissa Dixon fought through some early trouble, but hung tough and controlled the fight en route to a decision win in her debut, and she is going to be slowly working her way up those women's bantamweight rankings. Next fight, Terrence McKinney with an impressive first round finish over Brendan Marotte. I mispronounced Marotte's name on last week's episode. That's my bad, but nonetheless, McKinney came out, sort of initially clinched with Marotte and then landed a beautiful knee on the exit. Sent Marotte down, followed up for the finish. First round win, no damage done. And McKinney has since called for his initial fight with Chris Duncan to be rebooked, which is a very intriguing fight. Tainara Lisboa improves to 2-0 in the UFC with a decision over Ravena Oliveira. She looked good. She was landing her shots. She controlled the fight. She is another one who will slowly be working her way up those women's bantamweight rankings eventually. Featured prelim, Darren Elkins staying ahead in the grappling exchanges and scrambles against TJ Brown and just being relentless with the pace, eventually making Brown submit with a rear naked choke. Very impressive for Darren Elkins. He's fought a lot of tough guys, been in a lot of tough fights. For him to be getting finishes like that at this stage of his career is beyond impressive. Christian Rodriguez versus Cameron Saaiman. It's unfortunate that this is the second time now where Christian Rodriguez has been booked against a promising young prospect, missed weight, and then went on to beat that promising young prospect, because he wins those fights, but now he has to move up a weight class. So what do those wins really do for him as well as the guys he beat? I'm sure the UFC has a lot of different fights planned for him at 145, and I'm sure they're tough matchups. Next fight, Michel Pereira making his middleweight debut against Andre Petroski. He landed a thunderous right hand and sat Petroski down and followed up for the finish. No damage done to him either, and he is looking to jump back in before the end of the year, potentially with a fight in December. Adrian Yañez versus Jonathan Martinez. Martinez was just relentless with those leg kicks and honestly put on a masterclass in chopping down somebody who is lead leg heavy. And Yañez had his moments of landing with the hands, but the amount of damage that was done by Jonathan Martinez's leg kicks was very, very obvious, to the point where Yañez couldn't even stand anymore. And all the credit to Yañez for hanging tough, but even more credit given to Martinez, given how impressive of a performance it was to get a stoppage by leg kicks. It's the second time he's done that, and he has also since called for a fight against either Pedro Munoz or Merab Dvalishvili. Both very interesting matchups, and both are fights that are honestly warranted for the sake of Martinez, considering the impressive win streak he's on at the moment. Co-main event, Viviane Araujo versus Jennifer Maia. Araujo seemed outmatched early on the feet compared to Maia, who was sticking and moving, doing her usual routine, but eventually Araujo timed that and gained control in order to initiate some grappling exchanges where she controlled a majority of the fight en route to a decision victory. It was also reported today that Maia has fought out her UFC contract and did not re-sign. So, former title challenger fought to the distance against Valentina Shevchenko. Pretty impressive, all things considered. In the main event, what a fight. Because early on, there was so many moments in that first round where the fight could have been stopped, and then Edson just kept hanging tough, kept circling out, kept getting back to the center of the cage, ate so many shots, obvious 10-8 round, and then comes out for the rest of the fight just chopping away at Sodiq's body. On top of the fact that Yusuff essentially blew his gas tank trying to finish Edson in the first round, I think this really depleted Yusuff and enabled Edson to sort of take over as the fight progressed. We saw him hurt Yusuff in the third round with that wheel kick. That third round could have also potentially been a 10-8 round. I saw people online mention that. Not a ridiculous proclamation, but at the same time, the fact that Edson came back winning rounds after almost being out of there, being seriously hurt in the first round, is all the more impressive. On top of the fact that he is 37 and has fought a lot of wars. He is actually the leader for Fight of the Night bonuses in the UFC. He got his 9th fight of the night against Yusuff here. And following the win, he called for a fight against Max Holloway. And I know any MMA fan would love to see a fight like that, especially at that stage in both of these guys' careers where they're both winning and they're both still putting on great fights. Obviously, Max is still chasing championships and Barboza is a little bit lower in the rankings, but regardless, very fun fight. That was UFC Fight Night, Yusuff versus Barboza. Now we're moving on to UFC 294. I'm going to go through every fight on this card very briefly, as well as the circumstances surrounding the co-main event at the moment. First fight on the card, Shara Magomedov versus Bruno Silva. So, Shara has a lot of hype surrounding him. He's an explosive striker based on the footage that has made its way around the World Wide Web. But keep in mind, a lot of his fights in the past have been modified MMA rules fights where I believe after 30 seconds of grappling exchanges, they stand them back up regardless of position or potential submission, which is just something to keep in mind. Bruno Silva, on the other hand, coming off of, I believe he lost to Brendan Allen, who's well on his way to title contention. Also been in there with Pereira. Just one of those guys that is a very worthy test in terms of what level you are on, especially for somebody like Shara who's making his debut. Only thing that could be a massive factor is the durability for the sake of Bruno Silva, considering the amount of tough fights he's been in. If he comes into this fight refreshed, looking fresh, maybe went a little bit lighter on the training approach in this one, it could benefit him. But either way, Shara Magomedov is a scary individual. Next fight, Victoria Dudakova versus Jinyu Fry. Dudakova is undefeated, won her UFC debut with a finish, and a matchup like this honestly favors her to do that yet again, in my opinion. Nathaniel Wood versus Muhammad Naimov. This is a sleeper scrap. It's at featherweight, whereas Muhammad Naimov made his UFC debut at lightweight against Jamie Malarkey, where he scored a excellent knockout, excellent counter shot. Very unexpected because it looked like he could have been on his way to a decision loss until he landed that shot. And he has no easy task in front of him in Nathaniel Wood, considering the fact that since moving up to featherweight, Nathaniel Wood is undefeated and he is so well-rounded in terms of his fighting style. He appears so comfortable wherever the fight goes. And I think that will favor him in a matchup against Naimov. But the thing is, Naimov has proven to be dangerous based off his UFC debut. So with that, I think we are in store for a very entertaining fight. this is just a fight to keep your eye out on, just considering the factors for each guy going into it. Next fight, Mike Breeden versus Anshul Jubli. So Jubli won the Road to UFC tournament last year, finishing Jeka Seragi in the finals. He is one of the few representatives of India who is in the UFC, and he's honestly a very, very good fighter. Based off what I saw watching him fight on the Road to UFC tournament, he's very skilled. Mike Breeden, he has been in some tough fights. He hung tough for a war against Natan Levy, but he's been finished by Alexander Hernandez and Terrence McKinney. He's 0-3 in the UFC. And if Anshul Jubli doesn't win this fight, I'm just curious to see who they'd match him up against next, because in the case of Mike Breeden, he has yet to win a UFC fight, and he's fighting somebody who is making their debut, which granted is a significant step down in competition for Mike Breeden compared to his previous opponents. But this is a toss-up fight. I don't know who to pick, because Jubli is really good, but Breeden is very tough. Next fight, Abu Zaitar versus Cedric Dumas. Cedric Dumas. If I mispronounced your name, apologies. Dumas is coming off a decision win against Cody Brundage, where he wrestled him for 3 rounds, controlled him entirely, just neutralized any threat that Cody Brundage could have brought. And Abu Zaitar is coming off a long inactivity spell. Hasn't fought since 2021, where he appeared on the Stipe versus Francis 2 card against Marc-Andre Barrial. Got finished in the 3rd round of that fight. And considering there's been no footage of him fighting since then, I would just favor Dumas, given that he has been more active up to this point. Next fight, you got the undefeated, young, incredibly well-rounded fighter in Basharat versus the heavily experienced, high-pace enforcement fighter in Victor Henry. And it's going to be on Basharat to control Henry in this fight and mix it up and keep him guessing, because the pace that Henry sets will either wilt you or force you to match it, which turns out to be an absolute dogfight, which is a fight that we have yet to see Javid Basharat be in. So, another fight to keep your eye on. Trevor Peek versus Muhammad Yahya. Trevor Peek is a wild man, and that plays equally as much in his favor as it does to his detriment, depending on how skilled his opposition is. Yahya has the advantage in experience and is making his UFC debut on friendly soil, which is going to enable him to be more comfortable going into this debut. But if Trevor Peek can just be his typical wild self and catch Yahya, there's always a possibility, because despite Trevor Peek being absolutely hell on wheels in terms of his fighting style, it has proven to be effective in the UFC. Despite him coming up short in his last fight, he won his first fight by finish. This is a tough fight to pick for the sake that this man is wild, and I have not seen enough footage on Muhammad Yahya. Next fight, Tim Elliott versus Muhammad Mokaev. This is another interesting matchup, because Tim Elliott has fought guys like Mighty Mouse, Davison Figueiredo, Brandon Royval, Mateusz Nicolau, a bunch. Excuse me. He's fought a bunch of guys that made it to the very top. And so he is that perfect test for Mokaev to see whether or not Mokaev can eventually elevate himself into title contention. With that being said, Mokaev was caught in a nasty knee bar in his last fight, and obviously that garners injuries. So how much did he recover in between then and now? And is that something that Tim Elliott could potentially exploit? Tim Elliott is a lot to deal with stylistically, and it's going to be on Mokaev to neutralize him and get the finish, which is entirely possible, but it's not going to be easy. Next fight, Muin Gafurov versus Said Nurmagomedov. Gafurov came up short in his debut against John Castaneda, and Saeed has been in and won and lost tough fights, especially with the one against Jonathan Martinez, where it was just such a competitive back and forth mixed martial arts fight where damage was not the number one indication of who won that fight. I just honestly think the experience up to this point favors Saeed, and I think that's going to benefit him in this matchup. But you never know. Gafurov could come in with something crazy and produce an unexpected finish. But all indicators point towards Saeed Nurmagomedov. Next, Ikram Alekseeva versus Warley Alves. Honestly, Ikram has to have otherworldly confidence in himself with the amount of opponent changes he's gone through in the build-up to this event. But with that being said, since Warley Alves has moved up to middleweight, he's been a lot more durable. He's gone the distance with a lot more ease, and he's been in tough fights. And if he can carry that into this matchup with Alekseeva, he can make it very tough on Alekseeva. But I will say, regardless, I see this fight being back and forth for however long it lasts. I do see Alekseeva getting his hand raised at the end of it, though. That knockout against Phil Hawes in his debut was precise striking, otherworldly precision. And I do think Warley's going to bring it to him. I just don't know if it's going to be enough for him to beat Ikram. Any man that goes through multiple opponent changes without a complaint or a peep is very confident. Mind you, the only loss in Ikram's career is to Khamzat Chimaev. So, just saying. Next fight, Magomed Ankalaev versus Johnny Walker. This is an interesting fight too. You have the explosive striker in Walker, who has shown a little bit of reservation in his previous bout, especially against Anthony Smith, where he won a decision. And he's going up against Magomed, who is very well-rounded, and he's good at mixing it up and keeping his opponents guessing in terms of what he's going to throw at him. I will say, Ankalaev has not been active at all this year in comparison to Walker, who has been very active this year. And if you want to, contribute activity to giving either one an advantage going into this fight, I'd have to give the advantage to Johnny Walker, because not only has he been active, but he's been actively winning, and he's been actively winning in different ways. He's getting finishes, he's going the distance, and he's leveling up. If Johnny Walker can win this fight, I'm just very interested to see how he pulls it off. At the same time, Magomed Ankalaev could have just as easily been training this entire year and improved his game to the point that he might be the next champion, because light heavyweight is a very open division still, especially with Alex Pereira and Yuri Prohaska going down in just about a month, a little less than a month. Co-main event, Kamaru Usman versus Khamzat Chimaev. Originally supposed to be Paulo Costa versus Khamzat Chimaev. Paulo Costa has issues with his elbow. In comes the former welterweight champion. I will say, I appeared on Bree Eckert's podcast this past week where we briefly talked about this fight, and I'd be lying if I said that this is an easy fight for Usman, because it's honestly probably the toughest matchup he could have taken, and he took it on short notice. Khamzat has been fully preparing for an absolute juggernaut in Costa, and I don't see his preparation having to change nearly as much to be ready. Usman, on the other hand, today was doing his open workout with Justin Gaethje, and there's a video that surfaced where he drops Gaethje gingerly for a takedown during the open workout while they're drilling, and you see Usman sort of present some discomfort physically, whereas Gaethje asks concerningly, "Are you good?" And you hear Usman say something popped, and one can only assume it's his knees, considering he has been public about his knee issues in the past. And if that is the case, that is only something that is going to further hinder his ability to win against Khamzat, because Khamzat is a bulldozer of a fighter. Obviously, a lot of people are going to say, oh, Khamzat fought Gilbert Burns to a decision. Gilbert Burns is way smaller than Usman. This, that, and the third. Gilbert Burns trains with Kamaru. I get all these factors, but if Kamaru's going into this fight any less than 100%, and he can still pull it off, then he obviously deserves the title shot, right? Especially with all the narratives surrounding him now with his knees or whatever. And honestly, with that being said, considering Khamzat had a tough weight cut in his fight against Gilbert before going to war, something that's not going to be as big of a factor given the fact that they're up a weight class, I just think that all the factors favor Khamzat just a little bit more. In the main event, originally supposed to be Charles versus Islam. Now we get Volk Islam 2. This is a tough fight to call too. Islam's had a full camp to prepare, and with that, he's going into this fight more well prepared overall. Volk, I feel like, is just going into this fight with a chip on his shoulder, especially coming off his finish against Yair in July. He had that fight, whereas after Islam and Volk fought in February, Islam stayed inactive, has not fought since, and that could be something that favors Volk, especially as he begins to get back into fight shape, because he took this fight on 10 days notice, and it came out that he was like 180 pounds when he accepted it. So Volk has a good amount of weight to lose. But even with that, we know that Team Volkanovski, in terms of game plan for a fight, in terms of approach to a fight, all of that stuff, they have proven to be second to none. I'm just curious to see who has improved more between their first fight and now. This fight favors Islam. It just does. It really does. Volk could pull off the impossible because he is the great. He's pound for pound, all that. But preparation-wise, Islam has the advantage. So it'd be dumb to bet against him. But the thing about MMA is that anything can happen. So let me know what you guys think of these fights, especially considering the circumstances surrounding the co-main and main event. And appreciate you guys watching, as always. Leave a comment regarding anything combat sports. I love talking all combat sports. And if you enjoyed, I'd really appreciate just a little thumbs up. This has been Michael Trochet with Casual Roundhouse Fight Talk. See you in the next one.